I think that there is a certain sense in which the idea that this is a peasants' revolt is incorrect. Actually, this is a revolt led by people, Dominic, who might perhaps better be described as Middle England. This is where Middle England is starting to discover its voice. So it's part of the paradox and fascination of this whole extraordinary event, which really is extraordinary. In a sense, if this is the wellspring of English radicalism, then it's the start of something very, very kind of new. And what makes it different to previous revolts? There'd been revolts throughout medieval England. Edward II had been deposed. Barons had risen against John. There'd been a civil war in the reign of Stephen and Matilda. Barons siding with kind of rival kings. But this is different because this is not led by magnates. This is not led by peers. This is led by a class of person who until this moment has not been heard really on the public stage of England.
So this is the common people of England making their entrance in the history books. And that is why for anybody on the left, particularly the kind of intellectual left in Britain, the Peasants' Revolt has come to be seen, hasn't it, as a sort of foundational moment. So it's the kind of event that if you are, a Jeremy Corbyn or something, it's one of the landmarks in your kind of personal history of England and Englishness, isn't it? And there are always articles in The Guardian saying, everyone should do the Peasants' Revolt at school. It's such an important moment. Socialism began with the Peasants' Revolt, all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, Ken Loach, the very kind of pro-Corbyn film director, he opened a memorial to the Peasants' Revolt on Smithfield, where there was another famous confrontation, which we'll come to in due course. And there's absolutely the sense in which this is the kind of thing that Billy Bragg would make a song about or something like that. And I think there's no question that it really does deserve this reputation. So Judith Barker, who wrote a brilliant book about this, she doesn't call it the Peasants' Revolt. Very significantly, she calls it the Great Revolt. In her book, England Arise, she says that the rebels did not seek personal advancement, but a radical political agenda, which, if it had been implemented, would have fundamentally transformed English society. And I think that's absolutely true. And Nigel Saul, in his biography of Richard II, says of this revolt that what happened in 1381 was altogether unique. But Dominic, it probably won't surprise you to know that I think that merely interpreting it as, socialism avant la lettre isn't entirely right. It is slightly more complicated than that. And that's precisely what makes it so fascinating and interesting.
So to put it into a bigger context, Tom, this is an uprising in southern England in the late 14th century, and it's become this sacral moment, dare I say, for the bearers of the left-wing flame. But it is also an episode in a long-running struggle that we've already devoted 4 podcasts to, because this is effectively part of our epic series on the 100 Years' War, isn't it? The great struggle between England and France in the High Middle Ages. So maybe we should recap a bit to remind people who listened to the 100 Years' War and to explain to people who didn't what's been going on and why it is that England has been pushed to this position where the common people, as it were, are desperate to kind of have their say and make their entrance onto the stage.
Right. So we did a 4-episode series on the 100 Years' War, and it was full of English heroism and victory, battles of Crécy and Poitiers. And then we did a kind of 10-minute coda, didn't we? Where basically it all went wrong and suddenly the English found themselves losing. And essentially at the high tide of English success, Edward III, the great conquering king, had made himself lord of pretty much half of France. But by the time that Edward III dies in 1377, all those victories have slipped away. And England is really left in France with 2 continental possessions. So Calais, which has been reconstituted as part of England, and Gascony in the southwest of France. Edward III, this great conqueror, he's slipped into his dotage. He's become the plaything of a highly avaricious woman called Alice Perrers, who is much hated across England. The Black Prince, Edward III's son and heir, victor at Poitiers, he has died. And when Edward dies, he is succeeded by the Black Prince's son, so Edward III's grandson, Richard II, who succeeds Edward on the 21st of June, 1377, and he is aged 10 years old. And this is not good for England. In the Middle Ages, it's terrible to have a child as a king. And a truce has been in existence, but it ends 3 days after the death of Edward III. And the moment it ends, a French fleet descends on the south coast of England. It kind of ravages it. In 1378, the English launch a campaign to try and capture a range of ports along the North French coast, so to complement Calais. This is an utter disaster. And then in December 1379, an entire fleet is shipwrecked off Cornwall. So essentially everything is going completely tits up for the English in the 100 Years' War. And it's terrible. Now, England relative to France is very small. It doesn't have the huge resources of land that France has. And so it's quite difficult for the English king to raise money. But if you're fighting a war against France, it has to be paid for somehow. And under Edward III, this radical development had been enshrined that essentially taxation can only be imposed on the people of England with the consent of the king's subjects as represented in Parliament.
Right.
And this is something really unusual in the context of medieval Europe. This idea that the commons should have a voice in how much money the king should be given to wage his wars. It becomes a fundamental principle with very, very enduring consequences for the future course of English history.
And when you say the commons, these are, for the avoidance of doubt, these are not politicians as we would recognize them. These are kind of local gentry, bigwig type people who are representing the interests of the propertied classes, effectively, such as they are.
Yeah, they're kind of JPs.
So that's justices of the peace, JPs. Yeah.
Justices of the peace, yeah. And they, as landowners, they have a feeling that everybody in the country should shoulder the burden, that they should not be the only ones coughing up. And they feel that lots of wage earners in the country aren't really pulling their weight. And so their solution to this problem in Parliament is to introduce a poll tax, whereby a flat levy is imposed and everyone has to pay it. And this is introduced in January 1377. And everyone has to pay for it. The only people who don't are children under the age of 14 and beggars, vagrants. But otherwise, everyone has to pay 4 pence. Now, this isn't a prohibitive sum. You could buy maybe a dozen eggs for 4 pence. And it's very easy to collect because you just go around and grab it from everyone. And it's viewed as a success. It raises enough money to enable the war effort to be funded. It's so successful that 2 years later, another poll tax is introduced. This one is more finely graduated. So you have 15 categories going from the very poorest who are still paying 4 pence, right the way up to almost £7 for the richest. This money is invested in the fleet that then sinks off Cornwall. So it's a kind of disaster. People have the feeling that all this money has been raised and they have nothing to show for it. So it's it's kind of like HS2, the kind of this railway that's had billions and billions lavished on it to link London to Manchester, and it's not going to reach the middle of London and it's not going to reach Manchester. So there's a slight feeling all this money has been wasted and the government is incompetent.